Welcome to the deep dive. We are so glad you're here with us today.
Yeah, really glad to have you joining us.
Because today, our mission is to unpack this really intriguing stack of notes and excerpts. It's all based on the philosophical and theological work of Norman Geisler and Frank Turek.
Right. It's a heavy stack, but incredibly fascinating.
It really is. And the central question we're exploring today is one that has sparked debates for literally centuries. We are asking, are miracles simply a sign of human gullibility, or are they actually a logical possibility?
And before we dive into the deep end here, it is really vital to set the framework for our discussion. The source material we are looking at today makes some very strong, very specific claims.
Oh, absolutely.
Claims about theology, about world religions, philosophy. So our job here is not to take a side. We certainly aren't here to endorse these viewpoints. Our goal is just to objectively map out the logical arguments the authors have built so you can fully understand their perspective.
All right, we're essentially playing the role of intellectual explorers today. And I promise you, there is a moment coming up. It's this brilliantly simple illustration involving just two cardboard boxes that completely shifted the worldview of a room full of skeptical educators.
Oh, I love that story. It is such a great aha moment.
It really is. But to get there, we have to start at the foundation. The authors lead with this major premise, which is just that truth exists. And they argue that through natural revelation, meaning, looking at the universe without the aid of any religious scripture, we can logically deduce a theistic God.
Right.
But where do they even begin building a case like that?
Well, they point to three major philosophical arguments to construct this foundation, starting with the cosmological argument. They argue that because the universe had a definitive beginning, it must logically have a
beginner.
Exactly, a beginner. And whatever created the universe of space, time, and matter must, by definition, exist outside of those things. So they deduce a creator who is infinite, timeless, and unimaginably powerful.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because having a incredibly powerful creator doesn't necessarily mean you have a personal or purposeful one. How do they bridge that gap?
That is where the teleological argument comes in. They look at the precise, highly specific fine-tuning of the universe. The authors argue that this level of complex design is empirical evidence of a purposeful, highly intelligent creator.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it isn't just raw power, it's directed, intentional power.
Which leaves the moral argument. I imagine this is how they get to a creator who isn't just powerful and smart, but also good.
Precisely. They argue that humans possess this innate objective moral law. It's a baseline understanding of right and wrong that transcends culture. And if there is an objective moral law, well, there must be a moral lawgiver who is absolutely morally pure.
Makes sense.
So when you stack those three arguments together, a timeless beginner, an intentional designer, and a pure moral lawgiver, Geisler and Turek, argue you arrive squarely at a theistic God.
But wait, does that mean they just write off every other worldview? Because stating that if this specific theistic God exists, then logically any other religion is structurally false. I mean, that feels incredibly dismissive. Are they really saying atheism, pantheism, and polytheism are just entirely wrong?
It is a sweeping claim, absolutely, but they do add a crucial layer of nuance here. They aren't saying that every single teaching within those other belief systems is completely false. They use the metaphor of a puzzle box top.
A puzzle box top.
Yeah, they argue that the foundational box top, like the core underlying worldview of those systems, is flawed, even if the individual puzzle pieces inside contain elements of truth.
So they acknowledge that you can have an incorrect foundation but still arrive at certain truth.
They do. In fact, the source explicitly notes that Hindus rightfully teach the concept of reaping what you sow.
Yeah.
They point out that secular humanists rightfully recognize the grim reality of evil in the world.
Right.
And they note that Mormons rightfully teach that there are moral standards humans ought to obey. The authors are just arguing that those valid truths are resting on a structurally invalid foundation.
Got it. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, their specific argument against polytheism is a really fascinating example of this logic. I was looking at their notes on multiple gods, and they take this almost mathematical approach to theology.
Ah, yes, the polytheism paradox. It is a very tight logical loop. They ask, why does the existence of a theistic God disprove the idea of multiple gods? Well, God, by their definition, is infinite. You simply cannot have more than one infinite being.
Because there's no room for another one.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
To distinguish one being from another, they have to differ in some specific way. If they differ, it means one lacks something that the other has. And if a being lacks something, it cannot be infinite. Therefore, there can only be one infinite being.
Wow. That is a surprisingly elegant way to frame it. This raises an enormous question for anyone looking at this argument. If this one, infinite, incredibly powerful theistic God exists, why the mystery?
What do you mean?
Well, why doesn't he just show up face to face, part the clouds, and tell everyone what to do? Why be so hidden?
That is the big question. The authors turn to a rather brilliant quote from C.S. Lewis to address this problem of divine communication. In his book, The Screwtape Letters, Lewis writes from the perspective of a senior demon instructing a junior demon, and he says of God, he cannot ravish, he can only woo.
Cannot ravish, can only woo. I mean, that implies a limitation on an infinite being, which sounds contradictory.
It sounds contradictory until you factor in human free will. The authors argue that if an infinitely powerful God were to simply overpower humans with his undeniable, overwhelming physical presence, it would essentially violate that free will.
It would just be terrifying.
Exactly. It would force terrified submission rather than a genuine free choice to believe. So the authors suggest God uses a much more subtle method to communicate and confirm his messages to humanity. They call it the King's Seal.
Right, so think back to the days before mass communication for a second. Before secure emails or digital signatures. If a king sent a royal decree across the country, he would stamp the hot wax with his unique signet ring. It had to be unusual, easily recognizable, and something absolutely no one else possessed. Geisler and Turek argue that miracles are God's seal. They are highly unique, unmistakable acts used to confirm that a specific messenger is actually speaking on behalf of the king.
Which brings us to the ultimate challenge. Are people even open to seeing that seal if it's placed right in front of them? The authors share an incredibly compelling story about a philosopher named Ronald Nash to illustrate this hurdle.
Oh, this is the cardboard box story.
Yes. So Nash was invited to speak to a group of Russian educators. Now, these educators had been raised their entire lives in a system of state-sponsored atheism. They had been thoroughly conditioned into a naturalistic worldview.
Meaning they believe that absolutely nothing exists outside the physical, material universe. No spirits, no creator, just matter and natural laws. Walking into that room must have been so daunting. How did Nash even begin to break through that kind of conditioning?
He used two small cardboard boxes. Nash stands in front of these deeply skeptical educators holding them up. One box is taped shut and one is wide open. He points to the closed box and says, here is the difference between your worldview and mine. You believe the physical universe is closed, that the material universe is all that exists.
Right.
Then he shifts to the open box. He says, I believe the physical universe exists too, but I believe it's open, that there is something outside the universe we call God. And then he delivers the punchline. He says, and God created the box. He physically reaches his hand into the open cardboard box and explains that just as he, existing outside the box, can manipulate its contents, a God who exists outside our universe can naturally reach in and perform miracles.
What a brilliant visual. And the source notes that light bulbs literally started going off all over the room. These educators hadn't necessarily dropped their atheism on the spot, but the analogy cracked the door open. It showed them that if you start with the assumption that the box is closed, well, of course, miracles are impossible. But if the box is open, miracles aren't just possible. They are a completely logical expectation.
What's fascinating here is the psychological impact of that shift in perspective. But of course, not everyone is convinced by the open box. Throughout history, major philosophical skeptics have tried to permanently weld that box shut. The authors dedicate a significant portion of their work to dismantling two heavy hitters in particular, Benedict Spinoza and David Hume.
Okay, let's start with Spinoza from the 1670s. Spinoza's argument is straightforward. He argued that miracles violate natural laws, and since natural laws are immutable, miracles are therefore impossible.
It's a very clean argument at first glance. But the authors dissect Spinoza's logic by pointing out a fundamental misunderstanding of what a natural law actually is in the scientific sense. They argue that natural laws are descriptive. They are not prescriptive.
Meaning they describe what usually happens, they don't prescribe what absolutely must happen under every conceivable circumstance.
Correct. They simply map the normal behavior of the physical world when left to its own devices.
The source uses a relatable analogy that I think perfectly illustrates this descriptive versus prescriptive idea. Think about playing baseball. When a baseball player reaches out and catches a falling pop fly, he is overpowering the force of gravity. He hasn't broken gravity. The law of gravity still exists and is pulling on the ball. He has just overpowered it with a different localized force. The authors argue that if finite human beings can overpower natural forces every single day, then surely an infinite creator who wrote the laws can reach in and overpower them as well.
That descriptive nature of science effectively handles Spinoza. But then we have David Hume. Hume's argument from the 18th century is much more sophisticated, and as the source points out, it's still taught as a foundational, unquestionable truth in many Ivy League universities today.
It is everywhere.
It really is. Hume's argument boils down to this. A wise person always bases their beliefs on the greatest evidence. Natural laws represent regular, repeatable occurrences. Miracles, by definition, are rare, unrepeatable occurrences. Therefore, Hume argues, the evidence for the regular will always outweigh the evidence for the rare, meaning a wise person should never, ever believe in a miracle.
Think about the last time you saw a really good magic trick or something genuinely unexplainable. Your brain probably did exactly what David Hume suggests. It frantically looked for the regular explanation, the hidden wire or the sleight of hand, because the rare explanation of actual magic felt too impossible to trust. It's a very compelling way to view the world.
It is compelling, but the authors systematically dismantle Hume's argument layer by layer. First, they point out the massive, glaring counterexamples within Hume's own naturalistic worldview. Think about the Big Bang. That was a profoundly rare, unrepeatable event. The origin of macro life from non-living matter. Rare and unrepeatable.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Even David Hume's own birth only happened once.
Exactly.
By his own rigid logic, he shouldn't believe in his own birth because it wasn't a regular, repeatable occurrence.
It highlights a fatal flaw in his reasoning. They argue that Hume fundamentally confuses probability with evidence. Just because an event is highly improbable doesn't mean we shouldn't believe it if we have solid, verifiable evidence that it occurred.
Right. Imagine you were holding a winning lottery ticket. The odds of winning the lottery are astronomically rare. But when someone has the winning ticket, we believe them. We don't drag the lottery winner into an office and say, hey, the evidence for the regular is always greater than the rare, so I'm going to need you to win the lottery 5 more times in a row before I believe you actually won.
Yeah, that would be ridiculous.
We look at the evidence, the ticket, the eyewitnesses, the verification. We don't just dismiss it because of the probability.
Furthermore, the authors bring in C.S. Lewis again to expose what they see as deep circular reasoning in Hume's logic. Hume basically says that our uniform experience as human beings shows that miracles do not happen. But as Lewis points out, how can Hume possibly know that human experience is uniform?
You'd have to know everything.
Right. We can only know our experience is uniform if we assume from the very start that all historical reports of miracles are false. Hume is assuming his conclusion, that miracles don't happen, in order to prove his premise that miracles don't happen.
And he essentially punishes the miracle for being exactly what it's supposed to be. He demands that a miracle be a regular event for a wise person to believe it. But think about that. If a miracle happened regularly every Tuesday at 4 p.m., it would just be a natural law. It wouldn't be a miracle anymore. It's an entirely impossible standard designed to automatically reject the very concept of the supernatural.
And the authors are remarkably confident in this rebuttal. The text details Norman Geisler presenting this exact critique of Hume at Harvard to total silence from the faculty. It recounts how a Princeton professor asked to see Geisler's critique before a scheduled debate and then mysteriously canceled due to a personal emergency and never rescheduled.
Wow.
Even Antony Flew, who is a very famous, very staunch philosophical atheist, offered a backhanded compliment.
Yeah.
He suggested that atheists desperately needed to invent better arguments against miracles because Hume's argument was simply not holding up to logical scrutiny.
That level of confidence is striking. But it leads us to a very practical, everyday question. If miracles are logically possible, and the major skeptics fail to rule them out, how do we know a real miracle when we see one? Because, let's face it, weird, unexplainable stuff happens to all of us. Not every glitch in the matrix or stroke of good luck is the king's seal.
This is a crucial distinction, and the authors are very careful not to label everything a miracle. They provide a very specific, rigorous definition to separate a true miracle from mere unusual events. To be the king's seal, it must meet 3 unyielding criteria. First, it must display instantaneous power that clearly transcends natural laws. Second, it must show intelligent design and purpose. It cannot just be an entertaining parlor trick. And third, it must promote moral behavior.
So no chaos or evil.
Right. God, being the pure moral lawgiver we discussed earlier, would not use a miracle to promote error, chaos, or evil.
So if an event doesn't hit all three of those marks, it belongs in one of 5 imposter categories that they outline. Let's run through these because I think it helps clarify what they're actually arguing for. What about situations involving incredible timing? Like the dense fog at Normandy that helped conceal Allied troops during World War II. It was beneficial, maybe even an answered prayer to those involved. Is that a miracle?
Under their definition, no. That falls into the first imposter category, which is providence. This is when events are prearranged through natural laws, not supernatural power. The fog was highly providential and certainly a welcome anomaly for the troops, but it was still just weather. It was not a suspension of natural law.
Okay, what about the dark stuff? People claim to see supernormal things associated with the occult or dark magic. How do the authors categorize that if they believe in a spiritual realm?
That brings us to the second category, satanic signs. The authors argue that if other spiritual beings exist in this open box universe, their power is strictly limited because they are created beings, not the infinite creator. These signs might look super normal to a human, but they are always associated with error, they lack true, universe-bending creative power, and they do not promote moral behavior.
Like Pharaoh's magicians.
Yes, the source cites the biblical example of Pharaoh's magicians who could mimic certain tricks, but ultimately couldn't replicate the actual creation of life from dust.
This next one is fascinating. What about someone claiming they cured their own severe illness through sheer positive thinking or a sudden mindset shift? I've heard stories of people seemingly willing themselves better.
That falls into their third category, psychosomatic cures. Mind over matter. The source includes a rather hilarious personal anecdote from Norman Geisler himself to illustrate this. Geisler genuinely believed he had a terrible allergy to blooming flowers. He's at a church preparing to preach. He looks down and sees a massive bouquet of flowers on the pulpit and immediately starts sneezing. Oh no.
His eyes are watering, his throat is itching. He asks the pastor to quickly move the flowers away, and the pastor looks at him and says, "Norm, they're plastic."
That is incredible. Wait, plastic.
Entirely fake. Norm realized the allergy was entirely in his head, threw away his allergy medication, and was totally fine from then on.
That's hilarious.
It is. The human mind is incredibly powerful, and it can affect the physical body in profound ways, but a psychological cure or a psychosomatic reaction is not a miracle.
Then we have the fourth category, which is magic. And by this, they don't mean wizardry. They mean stage magic. David Copperfield making the Statue of Liberty disappear or pulling a rabbit out of a hat. It is a highly practiced illusion, unnatural to the observer, but completely human-controlled and reliant on sleight of hand.
And finally, anomalies. These are unexplained freaks of nature that have an observable pattern. The classic example in science is the bumblebee. For a very long time, scientists mathematically could not explain how a bumblebee could fly with such disproportionately small wings. According to known aerodynamics, it seemed impossible. But they fly anyway.
Right. But because there was a pattern, literally every healthy bumblebee could fly, scientists knew it wasn't a daily miracle. They just needed to understand the natural mechanism better, which they eventually did.
Okay, so we have defined what a miracle is, and we know what it isn't. We've mapped out how the authors defend the logical possibility of them, but I know what you're probably thinking right now because I'm thinking the exact same thing. If all this is possible and the box is open and God can reach in, where are the miracles today? Why isn't the morning news broadcasting seas parting or fiery pillars leading traffic on a daily basis?
This raises an important question about how we view ancient texts versus modern expectations. What's fascinating here is that the authors address this exact elephant in the room by looking at the historical distribution of miracles. It is a very common misconception that the Bible, for instance, portrays miracles as happening constantly, every single day, for thousands of years of human history.
It doesn't.
No, the source points out that while the text records about 250 miracles, they are not evenly distributed. They are actually heavily intentionally clustered in just 3 tiny windows of history.
Right, looking at their timeline, it's basically the lifetime of Moses, the era of the prophets Elijah and Elisha, and the time of Jesus and the apostles. Vast stretches of centuries in between feature almost zero miraculous activity.
Exactly. And the authors argue there is a highly specific reason for those tight clusters. Those were the exact periods when new revelation, or fundamentally new truth about God, was being delivered to humanity, and those new messengers needed to be authenticated. Remember the concept of the king's seal. You only stamp the hot wax when you are sending a brand new royal decree.
So if the message has already been delivered, you don't keep sending empty envelopes with wax seals on them just to prove you have the ring.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The authors argue that because all necessary foundational truth has already been revealed and adequately confirmed during those specific clusters, there is simply no logical need for God to publicly, dramatically display the King's seal in that massive, undeniable way today.
So what does this all mean for us? Let's synthesize the journey we've been on today. According to the source material provided by Geisler and Trek, if you look at the universe logically, from the Big Bang to the fine-tuning to human morality, there's a strong philosophical case to suggest the box of our universe is open, created by an infinite theistic God. And if the box is open, miracles are an entirely logical possibility. The classic enduring arguments by skeptics like Spinoza and Hume fail to definitively rule them out when you examine their underlying assumptions. But crucially, true miracles aren't just random magic tricks, psychosomatic healings, or weird anomalies. They act as a highly specific King's seal used exclusively to confirm divine truth.
It is a meticulously constructed argument, whether you ultimately agree with their foundational premise or not. And it forces us to deeply examine our own operating assumptions. Because the source material argues that your underlying worldview, whether you believe the box of the universe is closed or open, determines exactly how you interpret reality.
It changes everything.
It does. And I want to leave you with this final, lingering question to ponder on your own. If you were to walk through tomorrow assuming the box is open, how might that change the way you interpret the everyday synchronicities, the unexplained events, or even those rare lottery ticket moments in your own life?
Now that is a brilliant question to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you some genuine aha moments and plenty to think about as you navigate your own open or closed box. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we will see you on the next deep dive.